Hi there, this is another video looking at upgrading to Joomla version 4, and in this video we're going to be looking at the Web Asset Manager. Now this is something that has been introduced in Joomla version 4, and I've been looking at Joomla 4.2.9 and I realized that because this is fairly new it is liable to change, so you may find that some of this information gets a wee bit out of date. However, in a nutshell, what the Web Asset Manager allows us to do is to manage our JS or JavaScript and CSS files and their dependencies. And it's described fairly well at this link here. This is the one here. And I'll be putting this and other links into the comments of the YouTube video so you can look at those at your leisure. Basically what you do is you define your JavaScript and your CSS files together with their dependencies in a file media/joomla.asset.json. You put all your JavaScript and CSS files again under that /media folder. In your code you then select those JS and CSS files or resources for the particular view that you're coding, and then what Joomla will do is it will look after outputting the JS and CSS HTML elements, the script tags, but it will ensure that the dependencies are handled. So if you've got something that is dependent upon something else, it will make sure that that something else is before the other thing in the list of script tags, so that the dependency is actually analyzed first by the browser. So this is the kind of picture that I have in my mind when I think of the Web Asset Manager. And there's 3 stages here. So after Joomla initializes, and it then goes to look to see which component the user is trying to access based on the user URL. So based on the URL, it will do some routing and work out which component is on that page. Is they're going to be responsible for displaying that page, and then it will go to that component. Now in our case it would become hello world, and it will try and read this file media.com hello world joomla.asset.json, and we're going to be looking at that file in a bit of detail, but it's in our media folder here, joomla.asset.json, and it will read in that file, which is basically a list of assets, list of JS and CSS files together with their dependencies, and it will create this sort of structure as I see it, with kind of assets in this container, but there will be then links between it, so there will be indications that this asset here is dependent upon this asset and this asset. This JavaScript is dependent upon this, maybe jQuery, maybe something else. So each component can have a Joomla asset.json file, and it's read just after the HTML document is set up, after the app initialization and routing, when it knows which component it's going to need to run. And there are also files for Joomla system vendor and templates, so we're going to bring those in. So if we look in the media folder, and if we look down at system here, you'll see a Joomla asset.json file there, and this is a list of the Joomla system assets. So there's stuff here like core and keep alive, these sorts of things. And also in the folder structure you will also find vendor, and there's one there. And this is things that are kind of external ones. So in here you will find jQuery migrate. Let's go. There's jQuery there. Right. So Joomla itself, all of the components have got their own joomla.asset.json file, plus their system ones and vendor ones, and also template ones, which we're not really going to be looking at here. So whenever Joomla reads these in, it will read all of these files in, not just the component ones, but also the system and vendor ones, into this repository here. So that is the first step done after initialization and routing, just after the HTML document set up. The next step is in our component code. And what we need to do is get a handle on the Web Asset Manager, which manages this. And we can do that via this document, because this document has got a link to that Web Asset Manager instance. And it's fairly simple to get using that. And then to specify that we want to use a particular script, we would call use script. Or if we want to use a particular CSS style, we would call use style. And that would go in here, and kind of, I think of it putting a tick against the asset that is actually going to be used in this particular instance. So that would be the second stage. And then the third stage, as you may be aware, the response to an HTTP request, the HTML that's going to be returned is specified by the template. So if we look at the template, I'm using the Cassiopeia template. So generally it's going to be index.php from the Cassiopeia template. And here's the HTML that's going to be returned. And you can see here that there are lots of kind of like holes in this HTML document where there's JDoc include. And when it gets a JDoc include, it tries to include what needs to be at that stage. So here we've got a JDoc include type equals styles, followed by a JDoc include type equals scripts. And when it's processing this file, it will then go to the Web Asset Manager. And for the type equals styles, it will render those styles. So it will pick out of the Web Asset Manager those items which are ticked, which are CSS assets, plus their dependencies. And then it will create the HTML tags associated with those. For scripts, it will pull out of this Web Asset Registry the assets which have been ticked, which have been used here, plus their dependencies, and it will create these script tags. But it will ensure that the dependencies, these ones here, appear in the list before the ones which are dependent upon them. So it will make sure that the dependencies are handled, so that if the second script refers to something in a first script, it will make sure that that first script is loaded first rather than the other way round. Otherwise, you're liable to get JavaScript errors. So let's look at an example. And here's our Joomla asset.json file. And we'll just look at this first one here, which is validate greeting. So whenever we have our code here, we have got greeting here, and we've got a bit of validation against that. And if we look in our code, there's a validate greeting field somewhere. Field, let me work it out here. Here it is. So this is the validate greeting JavaScript that is going to be run, and you can see it's running a regular expression there, which basically said that there's no X's allowed in the greeting. So if we go down here and put in something like fix and go to the next tab, this value is not valid because there's an X in it. Okay, so that's all it's basically doing. It's basically checking if there is an X in the greeting. And we have introduced that via our whenever we create our forms. So we have got a TMPL file for that. Hello world edit.php. And here we see in our HTML file, or sorry, in our edit.php use script. So we're actually using this script, validate greeting. And what we're then doing is we're taking this asset here, which is defined here, and we're including it in our list of assets which are actually going to be pulled in and actually output down here by Joomla. If we look at this in a bit more detail, the type, by the way, here's the schema. So if we click on that, you can actually see the schema. Let me just grab that. Copy link and paste. So this is the definition of what can be put in that JSON file. I'll leave that for you to look at later. But here we've got its type script, so it's JavaScript. Its URI is com hello world validate greeting.js. Now here you've got to be a bit careful, because where we would put this in our own code is in our media folder under JS. You can see that it's validate greeting. So if I look at the so it's media.js validate greeting, and whenever that is loaded, then whenever the com hello world is installed, it gets put in here, and you can see up there it's media com hello world JS validate greeting. But actually, whenever you're putting your items into the asset file here, it hasn't got the JS folder in. And what Joomla actually does, it opens up this URL here and actually puts JS in and then looks for this file under media. And then what you need to put is your dependencies. So here the dependencies are form.validate and jQuery. Well, how do we know which dependencies to put in? Well, if we look at our bit of JavaScript code here, obviously we've got jQuery here. So jQuery is likely to have to be something we need to have as a dependency. And as I said, we can find that in our Joomla asset.json file within vendor, and we need to make sure that the name we put in matches this name here. So that is what it's going to be looking for in here. The second thing we're going to be looking for is this form validator. So we've got something here called form validator, which is obviously not standard JavaScript. It's been brought into some library. So what I've just done in the past is look at form validator and look for in media system, and you can do that. And if we look for JS files there, we can find where form validator is in the JS files. And if we look down here, we can see something that sets short for JForm validator, and there's the line there. So we're actually setting form validator. So that is the line that we need to really have included, and it's in validate.js. So if we look at our this time system ones, we look for validate.something and we'll find it there. So there's our this is our file that we want to find, and you can see if we look up here, it's in system.js fields validate, and in our system Joomla file, Joomla asset file, we can see here form.validate is the same system fields validate, and there are obviously various variants, whether it's minimized or ES5 or that. But basically what we want to include is here, the form.validate. And we can go through in any JavaScript that we have in our component, we can kind of work out which are the Joomla JavaScript files that we need to include, and from there we can actually generate what needs to be put in as the dependencies. In this case, we're looking at the system, form.validate, and jQuery. I'm going to be looking at these attributes in a wee minute. So that's our example, and if we then look at our website, here is the website here, and if we look at our dev tools, we have got in the head, if we just go down here somewhere, we should find, we go up a bit. We should find our validate. Now, sorry, let me find this. Here's our system one. Here's our vendor jQuery one. And somewhere there should be our own one. Here it is, right down at the bottom. You can see come hello world validate greetings. So there's our one that we included, and there's our dependencies, the fields validate.js and jQuery. And notice that they have come up earlier in the list of script tags because they are dependencies which this thing here requires. So that's basically how it works. Let's have a look at a few more features. Use script. So in our code, to use a predefined script, which we've got in our Joomla asset JSON file, the function that we use is use script. And we saw that in our example here, which was in edit.php, use script here. And you specify the name in the joomla.asset.json file of the resource that you want to use. And similarly, use style. The third thing is a preset. So if you have a related group of scripts and or styles, you can use preset, which kind of groups them all together. And I've done that for the map stuff. So whenever we introduced a map, which was in this step here, we introduced a map, and if we go to show the map here in Hello World, you can see here's the map here. So that involved having some CSS to kind of set the map, and it also had some JavaScript, and it also was reliant upon external open layers JavaScript and CSS libraries. So if we look at our JSON file here, we've got somewhere down here com hello world OpenStreetMap. And this is set as a preset, and dependencies com hello world OpenStreetMap hash style, which basically means there's another com hello world OpenStreetMap asset whose name is an asset, but it's got a type style, and you see that down here. And similarly, com hello world OpenStreetMap script, and there's the same name, com hello world OpenStreetMap, but a type of script. So within presets, you can use this kind of notation with a hash and the type that you're including to specify whether it's CSS or JavaScript. You can't use this format within a dependency which is a particular type or style. So for example, you couldn't put hash script or hash style. Basically, if it's dependency of a style or a script, it's going to be looking for the same sort of thing. So if it's a style, it'll look for a CSS style dependency. If it's a script, the dependencies will be of the script type. So you just put this style and script in the presets, but it does mean that you can manage these a lot more easily. So for example, if you have you know, a number of pages which use the same present a map, for example, you just have one line of code which includes this preset in your, for example, TMPL file, or I think I had it in the map file in the view. Whenever you add the map, here's the, add the map, here's your use preset. Okay, so it's bringing in that preset here. Okay, so that's presets, add inline script. So if you're creating JavaScript in a dynamic way, and the only example we have that in the tutorial is in the modal field. So the modal field is here, and whenever you are, that's it there. So whenever you're generating the JavaScript dynamically and want to include it in, then you would use this function, which is add inline script. And I'm just going to try and find that. I think it's somewhere here. There it is there. Okay. So here's a web asset manager we've got here. And then we're using this line, add inline script, to add just some JavaScript into the web asset manager. And that will mean that that script is going to get output as well with the rest of the scripts by the web asset manager. When it's got this stage here, it will be output. Version, right. So if you think about whenever you have something like this, you've got JavaScript in which are kind of brought down to your web page here. So if we have a look at this and network, if I do a reload, and let's look at JavaScript. Okay, so if we look at the JavaScript, there's a whole lot of JavaScript that is brought down whenever we do a reload associated with the map. So there's our OpenStreetMap JavaScript that has been included. And if you notice over here, it's marked as cached. So whenever it's found that script, it hasn't actually gone back to the web server to pull that JavaScript back. It's just used its cached version. And in fact, there's also an open layers. If we go to the Joomla.json, there's an open layers here JavaScript file, which doesn't appear here, and because it's cached as well. So if you think about what happens whenever your component is installed and updated, so if you issue a new version of your component and it's installed on some on some server somewhere, and the people who are using it have got their browsers and they go on to use the newer version of your code, it could be that the JavaScript you've updated on your server doesn't get used because they're using the cached version. And if they've just got this cached version in their browser, they're not necessarily going to be going back to the server to get a new version of it. So you could find problems there. And that's where this version number comes in, because if I go down here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into the live JSON file. Here it is here. So I'm just going to move this into a new instance so I can see that it's separate. This is the live instance. So if I look at something like OpenStreetMap.js, it's 1.0.0. What I can do when I update my code is I can go into my code and update that version number. So if I go to OpenStreetMap.js and I'll change it to 1.1.1. Now remember, this is actually the live JSON file, it's not in my development directory. And then when I click on this here, you'll see here OpenStreetMap.js at 1.1.1, but because the version number has changed, it hasn't actually used the script. So, or sorry, it hasn't actually used the cached version. So there's no cached version here. It's actually gone to the server. So if you're got a component where you're updating the JavaScript, it's a very useful feature to have this version number here and set it associated with the version of your code, because it does mean that if you're updating your code and it's being installed on a server, then people who have got the cached version in their browsers will refresh that JavaScript. It won't use the cached version. Finally, defer. And if you have a look at the close that. If you have a look at the system one, you'll see that there's a lot of these system ones which have defer equals true. So for example, we are dependent upon form.validate. So if we go and look for form.validate, we can see attributes defer is true, and that then will get output in the HTML. So if we again look at this over here, this is the validate.csjs, and you see there's the defer there. And as far as I understand it, what defer does is whenever the browser is processing this HTML document, whenever it gets a JavaScript like this, a script statement, if there isn't a defer or an async, then it will kind of pause browsing or pause processing and parsing of this HTML file, go and get that JavaScript, and then continue on once it's got it. If, however, it's got defer there, it will initiate the transfer of this JavaScript file from the server, but will continue on down through parsing the HTML document. And then when it's finished with the HTML document, it will then run the JavaScript, it will process the JavaScript items which have been then brought down using this defer. But the thing about defer is it will do them in order. So if there are a number of items which have got defer on, then it will run those JavaScript files, source files, after it's got the HTML document down, but it will run them in order of when it's found them here. If you have set async, it's something different. It will again initiate the transfer down independently and continue on down the HTML document. But with the difference with async is whenever the async file is actually received by the browser, it will then go ahead and analyze it there, run the JavaScript there and then. So that may then be before one of these dependencies here with a defer. So from that point of view, it's always best to put on defer onto your JavaScript as a JavaScript attribute onto your Joomla.asset.json assets here, because you then know that it will be coming after these ones here, which also have defer on. If you didn't put defer on there, they could well be run and analyzed before one of the dependencies. So that's that. Then the last couple of things, text. So what we've been seeing here is that a lot of the previous ways that we included JavaScript and CSS have been deprecated. So if we look at some of the APIs here, you look at document, and before we had things like add style sheet and add style declaration, and they're now deprecated, and the idea now is use the web asset manager, as in use style or use script, add script declaration. So those are now deprecated, and we should be using the web asset manager ones instead. However, document add script options is still valid. So you can see add script options isn't deprecated, and we used add script options actually in our map whenever we wanted to pass data down to our map, and I think it might have been this one here. There's the add script options, so it's still valid, as is this text if we wanted to pass down language strings to the JavaScript to output them in some specific language or other. The ability to do that with text script is still valid. There's no deprecated marker on that. And also you can also find the web asset manager APIs on this one, so that you can find all the details of add inline script and kind of register and use script. The components seem to be the only extension, components and templates, ones where they've got JSON asset.json files, but other items such as modules and plugins can use register and use script, which will actually generate an asset in here and actually set it as being used. So finally, we're going to look at upgrading to Joomla 4. What do you need to do? Well, you need to make a list of your custom JS and CSS files, and in particular work out their dependencies. And you can do that, as we demonstrated earlier, by searching for what looks like dependencies in your code. You need to create the Joomla.asset.json file and put it into your media folder. You need to move your JS and CSS files into media. You need to remove anything which is JHTML with behavior, and I've put a list of those into this upgrade file, and it's somewhere down here. So things like behavior framework was a mechanism that we used to include jQuery. So if you're including that in your version 3 code, you need to then shift that out and either have jQuery listed it as dependencies, dependency of some other bit of JS that you've got, or just use script directly. Another example is form validator, and that's where we've got use script form validate, or if you're doing kind of special validation like we're using on the greeting, you can set it in as a dependencies. And there's a couple of others there. There are other frameworks in Joomla, so you may have some of the code here which you'll need to switch out and use a particular script instead. And then include the calls to use scripts and styles in your code. Finally, there's a couple of JavaScript changes. So in version 3 we had a specific code for submit button.js, and whenever we do a submit, whenever we've got something like a form here, there's generally a couple of buttons here, and if we want to do save, then we want to run the validation on here. If we want to do cancel, we don't want to run the validation on here. If we want to save won't get you any further before you, if you don't fix up things like this. I can press save and it doesn't do anything. However, if we want to cancel it, we want to stop the validation and not run the validation. So in our version 3 code we had this submit button.js which did specifically that, looked at the differences between cancel and save. However, in version 4 the submit button.js file is a bit more sophisticated, and the functionality you can find in the core system.js, I think it's core.js. It is, yeah. And it does a bit more functionality there. For example, it checks if the cancel task, if the task is something like hello world.cancel, then it won't run the JavaScript form validation. Or as it mentions in the on this page here, if you submit button.js, here it is here, if you pass in this third parameter, set it to false, then it won't run the validation. So there's some differences there. You just have to look at your submit button.js files if you have that in your component and work out, do you really need it, or does the Joomla version work okay? And very finally, whenever we had ordering on our component, so if we look at our component, we did this sort of thing to reorder, and that uses a JavaScript library which in version 3 was sortable, and in this version is draggable. So you need to change that. Plus the draggable library assumes different CSS classes on your elements. So you have to go in and look at your TMPL file there and change the classes on some of the elements. I'll just find that here. So there should be a draggable, oops. It's including draggable there, and in some of these items here you're going to need to change what is actually output on your data URLs and this sort of thing. I can't remember exactly what it is, but if you have a look at the code in the tutorial, it'll give you an example of that. Okay, that's about it for this video. Thanks very much for watching. Bye.